The town was called Walden, though the lone traveler was unaware of this. He had chosen the road at random, guided only by the fact that it seemed the most well-trodden. He had no horse and traveled on foot, carrying nothing but a sword sheathed at his side and a small bag slung over his shoulder. "Is that him?" Rupert asked skeptically, openly studying the tall, dark-haired young man approaching the gates. Today, he and Arthur were playing the roles of guards, having bribed the soldiers to let them take their place for a while. Both men were of average height, lean and wiry, completely unfit for the robust builds typical of real guards. The uniforms they'd acquired hung loosely on them, clearly stolen from larger men, but they had no better options. The traveler looked very young, almost like a boy, but walked with a calm confidence, as though this road wasn't leading out of a forest notorious for being traversed only by well-armed groups. His bright gray eyes swept over the faux guards with serene curiosity, pausing briefly on the open gates before continuing to the road that led deeper into town. His clothing was modest but well made, the kind a hunter might wear on extended trips into the woods. Low leather boots, sturdy pants, a shirt with ties at the collar, and a hooded leather jacket. Everything he wore was in dark shades of gray, devoid of any insignias or markings that might reveal his lineage or trade. "It's him," Arthur said quietly. Isolde described a lone traveler, and there's no one else passing through. He matches the description. "How old is he?" Rupert whispered, still doubtful. It was hard to believe the one they called the Cursed Prince could be so young. 16. He disappeared as a child. It's been 5 years. 16? Sure, Rupert muttered, recalling the final lines of their contract. Subdue the target. Inflicting serious injuries is permissible in the event of resistance. The boy needed to be taken alive, though clearly only for a limited time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed to harm him. The whole situation felt odd. The prince had vanished 5 years ago, with relentless searches conducted ever since. Yet now those efforts had suddenly intensified, leading to this moment. Thanks to Isolde's magic, they had tracked him here. She had used an object that once belonged to the prince to pinpoint his location. It was sheer luck or fate that their group had been near Walden when the discovery was made. He's too calm. "What if this is a trap?" Rupert murmured. "Isolde said there are no other travelers in the area," Arthur repeated, shaking his head. "He's alone." The two exchanged glances as the boy walked past them without a word or a glance their way. As supposed guards, they had no reason to stop a traveler who posed no threat. And what threat could a boy armed with nothing but a sword possibly pose? Stopping him without cause would draw the attention of the locals, who were known for their nosy curiosity and lack of entertainment. It was better to wait and act discreetly. The important thing was that their target was here, and he wouldn't be leaving any time soon. Had Isolde been a more powerful sorceress, their task would have been simpler. They could have intercepted him on the forest road, subdued him there, and ensured no one ever learned of his passage. Unfortunately, all she could determine was that he was nearby and moving in their direction. This forced them to wait in Walden, not knowing which path he would take to arrive. Walden was a crossroads for trading routes, with only one set of gates, but numerous junctions on the open plain surrounding the town. They were fortunate the season was over. Otherwise, caravans would have been streaming in one after another. As it was, only one traveler had arrived in half a day, their target. "Ah, I get it," Arthur said suddenly, tension in his voice as he stared at the boy's retreating figure. "I know why he's alone and where he's coming from. It all makes sense now." "Well, Don't keep me in suspense, Rupert urged. There's a turnoff from that road. It leads to the Avalon portal. Didn't you hear? The gates opened this morning, Arthur said excitedly. He's been gone for 5 years, Rupert, and he's coming from Avalon's direction. That's where he's been hiding. Uh-huh, Rupert muttered, pushing back his helmet to scratch his head. His unruly red hair immediately poked out in all directions. Makes sense, except for one thing. They only take the doomed, and they definitely don't let anyone leave. But hey, it's a decent theory. Decent? It fits perfectly, Arthur countered. Who knows who they accept or don't accept? Those are just rumors. The main thing is that the portal opens once every 5 years. That's when the prince disappeared, and now that the portal's open again, he's returned. It all lines up. Fine. He'll tell us himself soon enough, Rupert said with a crooked grin. Isolde knows how to ask questions. Right, Arthur replied, watching as the boy paused near the gates at an inn's courtyard, stopping to study a notice pinned to the fence. The mercenary clenched his fists involuntarily. Damn timing. Last night, heralds had arrived in Walden to announce that King Edmund was resuming the search for his son. A reward had been posted for any information about the cursed prince, with notices bearing his description plastered all over town. The good news was that the description was of an 11-year-old boy. Gray eyes and black hair weren't exactly rare in the kingdom. Everything else was vague enough to pass for anyone. The boy finally moved on, entering the courtyard. Moments later, a group of 10 drunk soldiers emerged from a nearby alley and headed toward the same inn. Arthur ground his teeth in frustration. The soldiers wore the colors of Dytra, a neighboring kingdom across the river. The Dytran border was guarded on their side, but nothing prevented their soldiers from crossing into Miros to visit towns like Walden. Relations between the two kingdoms had always been friendly. Unfortunately, these visits often led to trouble, as Dytran soldiers were known for their disdain for being refused anything, whether a favor, money, or otherwise. I'll keep an eye on them, Arthur said decisively. I don't like this. Rupert nodded and gestured toward 2 figures blending in as ordinary townsfolk, heading toward the gates of the inn courtyard. Commander Conrad and Isolde, a tall, broad-shouldered man, and a dark-haired, olive-skinned woman. The rest of their group was somewhere nearby as well. Arthur spotted them too, but decided to step in after the boy. The guard uniform he wore might come in handy during the upcoming encounter. The faux guard stepped into the wide courtyard, scanning the area with a quick but practiced eye. He had been here many times before, and knew the layout well. To the right was the stable, with several loaded wagons lined up against the wall. Their owners paced nearby, making last-minute preparations for departure. Straight ahead lay the tavern doors, from which cheerful voices spilled out. The Dytran soldiers were likely in there. All that remained was to locate the boy. Arthur had been about to head toward the tavern when a flash of a dress near the stable caught his attention. Isolde was there, casually chatting with a visiting merchant while Conrad strolled nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the stable gates. Arthur hesitated and decided to wait. What troubled him most was the Dytran soldiers constantly peeking out the tavern windows. A moment later, 4 of them emerged into the courtyard, turning their attention toward the stable. They spoke boisterously, laughing now and then. Arthur cursed under his breath. From the stable gates emerged the dark-haired boy, leading a saddled black horse, clearly newly purchased. Behind him hurried a stable hand, speaking quickly, only to freeze when he spotted the soldiers. The man hesitated, then backed away nervously. The boy, however, followed him with a calm, unreadable gaze, stroked the horse's muzzle, and began leading it toward the courtyard's exit. Arthur tensed. There was no way the prince would be allowed to leave unhindered. A lone boy was far too easy prey for men seeking amusement. The Ditron's chatter turned into loud calls as the 4 soldiers briskly crossed the courtyard, blocking the gate. The others poured out of the tavern and joined their comrades. Other guests appeared as well, eager to watch the entertainment so long as it didn't involve them, and even local townsfolk began gathering at the gates. Before long, the inn courtyard was packed with spectators. Arthur's gaze darted to Conrad, who shook his head. Stay out of it. Conrad was right. The boy would likely escape with bruises and humiliation. After all, Walden was a peaceful town, and outright murder was unlikely. If anything, the encounter would make him an easier target for their group later. The cursed prince stopped, looking questioningly at the soldiers blocking his path. Arthur noted with some unease that there wasn't even a hint of fear on the boy's face. He studied him more closely now, a striking face with sharp yet delicate features. It was immediately clear he wasn't just a wandering vagabond. But who here would care about that? Certainly not the Ditron soldiers. 2 broad-shouldered warriors stepped forward, speaking in mocking tones. They declared it a tradition to welcome travelers with food and drink. And since their group was generous, they were more than willing to share their provisions with the weary boy. Of course, they expected him to share his own supplies in return. That was the custom. And if he didn't have enough to share, no matter. They'd teach the young pup how to drink properly. The boy gave a slight shake of his head, a strange smile flickering across his lips, mocking and cruel. He let go of the horse's reins, stepped back, and slapped the animal's flank, sending it off to the side. "I'm afraid I don't have enough money to feed your company," he said, his voice calm and detached. "But I do have something else." His gloved hand moved to the hilt of his sword. The Ditrans burst out laughing. Compared to their towering muscular frames, the tall but lean boy looked like a puppy among wolves. But when the blade left its scabbard, the laughter faltered. The sword gleamed silver in the sunlight, intricate runes flashing along its edge. The weapon was unlike anything they'd seen. Its shape, its craftsmanship, even its sharpness didn't conform to any known standards of smithing. It was otherworldly, impossibly beautiful. The Ditrans froze. An Avalon blade. A red-haired giant stepped forward, his greedy eyes scanning the weapon. "Where did you get that, pup?" "No matter. You don't have to tell us. We'll take it off your hands without a story." "Right, boys?" Laughter erupted again. The giant closed the distance between them, stopping a mere 3 paces from the boy. "So, kid, are you going to gift it to us willingly? Or do you want to put up a fight first?" He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "We enjoy a good game." "So do I," the boy replied, his Avalon blade cutting through the air in a swift, blinding arc. His opponent's sword remained sheathed, but the boy wasn't deterred. His strike aimed low. A heartbeat later, the red-haired soldier's eyes bulged in pain as he collapsed to the ground, his legs nearly severed. The boy stepped back, retreating to the open space of the courtyard, away from the howling man. Arthur exhaled sharply. The boy had struck first? Was this why they called him the Cursed Prince? Surely it wasn't just because his father had stripped him of his inheritance and title. The Ditron soldier stopped laughing. The sound of swords being drawn filled the courtyard. 9 against 1. "You'll regret that, pup," one of them growled. "You won't leave here alive." The drunken haze vanished from their faces, replaced with cold fury. The warriors attacked with a calculated precision, 4 moving to encircle the boy while the others held back to avoid getting in each other's way. The silver blade flashed, meeting their advance. The clash of steel rang out, but then the soldiers staggered, stepping back. Their swords fell from their hands, clattering onto the stone ground. To the spectators' horror, the hilts were still clutched by severed fingers. The boy had cut off the right hand of each of the 4 attackers. "Ah!" came the agonized screams. The remaining soldiers charged. The wounded staggered away, groaning in pain. The boy waited, his blade lowered. Scarlet drops rolled off its silver surface. This time the prince moved to meet them. His motions were mesmerizing, almost like a deadly dance. But there was no elegance in it, only inevitability. He moved with a precision that defied human limits. A step forward, a blade slicing into an opponent's weapon. The Avalon blade moved with uncanny speed, deflecting the heavy swing of a 2-handed sword and continuing its path toward the wielder. To the onlookers, it seemed as if the boy had simply stepped past the Ditran soldier, but the man let out a choked gasp, clutching his stomach before collapsing to the ground. The silver blade completed its arc, warding off 2 more strikes, and its owner's next move left 2 more men writhing on the dirt. Defense and attack merged seamlessly into a single motion. The remaining Ditran soldiers wasted no time. They moved to strike him from behind, one aiming for his back, the other swinging for his head. But their target wasn't where they expected him to be. The cursed prince glided forward, turned sharply, and in one swift motion, his blade scattered their heavy swords aside, leaving their owners exposed. One soldier reeled from a deep stab to his right shoulder, while the other nearly lost his arm as the Avalon blade sliced clean through the flesh of his wrist, stopping just shy of the bone. The fight was over in moments. It wasn't dramatic. It was terrifying. 10 Ditran soldiers writhed on the ground in agony, but all of them were still alive. The boy regarded them with a dispassionate glance, crossed the courtyard without a word, and caught hold of his horse's reins. Leading the animal calmly, he headed once more for the gate. The crowd parted quickly to let him pass, murmuring nervously among themselves. Behind him, voices whispered the same words over and over. "Madman! Sorcerer! Sorcerer!" The boy galloped through the main street of the town, glancing back in frustration only when he reached the outskirts. He muttered a quiet curse. He'd hoped to buy not just the horse, but also supplies at the market. Now that chance was gone. He swore again under his breath, spurring the horse to a gallop, and putting as much distance as he could between himself and the town. When the rooftops of Walden finally disappeared from view, he slowed the horse and pulled the reins. The animal snorted and came to a stop. The boy reached into the saddlebag for his flask of water. Luckily, he'd managed to pack his provisions back at the stable and took a couple of sips. He shook the flask. Only a small amount remained. He hadn't had time to refill it at the well and would now need to find a spring. And as for his plans to buy a bow for hunting, those were gone too. No dinner, no lunch, not until the next town. Though whether stopping there was wise was another matter entirely. He urged the horse into a steady trot, his mind returning to the notice he'd seen back in Walden, the one announcing a reward for any information about the cursed prince. Is that what they call me now? His father had stripped him of his title and inheritance, but now it seemed he had gone further, declaring him accursed. 5 years ago he hadn't known about that. His return to his homeland had been far from smooth. Twice on the forest roads, he'd been ambushed by men who were likely bandits. He hadn't stopped to confirm their identities. Their intentions had been clear enough. They attacked without warning, and he responded in kind by killing them. Then there were the guards at Walden's gate, who hadn't looked like typical soldiers. They had a strange air about them, more like foreigners. And while the Dytran soldiers had harassed him simply because he seemed like easy prey, the two guards had been far more unsettling. Add to that the notice by the inn gate. The description was vague, but it emphasized one thing: a lone traveler who drew attention. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Perhaps someone already had. Damn it, he muttered, clenching his fists. And now his Avalon blade had drawn attention too. It was no wonder the stable hand had panicked the moment the boy walked in, asking to buy a horse. The Dytran soldiers had been prowling Walden for a week, targeting anyone without serious protection, and occasionally harassing the locals for good measure. A boy, clearly alone yet carrying money and making an expensive purchase, would have raised anyone's suspicions. The stable hand had likely feared the boy would try to hide in the stable, which was why he'd rushed to send him away. But it hadn't worked. He sighed. Sorcerer, huh? They'd called him that in Avalon too, despite his choice to follow the path of a warrior, not a mage. He had nothing to do with magic, not really. His innate abilities didn't count, did they? He'd consciously chosen not to use them. He hated magic. Magic had killed his mother 5 years ago. The sound of hooves broke his thoughts. He turned sharply. A group of riders, 20 or more, was galloping from the direction of the town. This couldn't mean anything good. He had no desire to face an armed party, especially one from a town where he'd just left several men severely wounded. He scanned his surroundings. The small grove of trees was already behind him. Ahead were open fields, and beyond them, the forest. Reaching the forest and disappearing into its depths was his only chance to escape. There was no other option. At the crossroads ahead, they waited for him. Well-armed men, many with 2 swords each, knives protruding from their boots and bows in hand. Their clothing bore no insignias, but their chests were protected by light armor of the kind worn by soldiers. Mercenaries. He counted 15 before they raised their bows. His hand instinctively pulled the reins, causing the horse to rear and turn sharply. The prince didn't understand why they didn't shoot. A moment later, he urged his horse into the forest, plunging into a reckless gallop between the trees. Thwack! An arrow struck the trunk of a tree inches from his head. He yanked the reins, veering slightly. Thwack! Another arrow grazed his shoulder before embedding itself in the bark ahead. These archers were skilled, firing from horseback even in the forest. Were they trying to stop him or kill him? He had no desire to find out. These pursuers were professionals, unlike the group that had initially ridden after him from the town. He'd noticed that the first party had stopped abruptly upon seeing the king's mercenaries, pulling their reins sharply and watching with frustration as their quarry disappeared into the trees with new hunters in pursuit. They clearly weren't working together, but that didn't make his situation any better. A chill ran down his spine, and he ducked instinctively. Another arrow grazed his forearm, leaving a sharp sting, but only a shallow cut. The conclusion was grim. Their goal was to kill him. Yet something else surprised him. His own perception of danger. He'd only ever experienced this in close combat before. A heightened awareness of his opponent's actions, allowing him to react faster than they could strike. In Avalon, they'd attributed it to innate magic, calling him a sorcerer. But magic and martial skill didn't mix. You either held a staff and nurtured your magical talent from childhood, if you had such a gift, or you picked up a sword, leaving magic uninitiated. He had chosen the latter. Thud, thud, thud. He barely managed to yank the reins, veering sharply behind a massive tree trunk. The horse let out a strained whinny, its breath rasping as it obeyed his command. The poor animal had been forced to change directions over and over again, driven hard by its rider. Its flanks bore several streaks of red, but thankfully no serious wounds yet. The pursuers hadn't fallen behind, though the gap between them and their quarry had yet to narrow. If anything, it seemed as though they were deliberately holding back, driving him toward a specific destination. Why? A sudden chill hit his face like an icy slap, and he nearly cried out. Crimson leaves and coal-black tree trunks flashed before his eyes. No. As a child, this forest had been nothing more than a frightening bedtime story told by his old tutor. How could it have been anything else? Lying under a warm blanket in a familiar, cozy room, knowing you were safe, it was easy to dismiss the cursed forest as just a tale. After all, it was far away, too far to worry about undead beings or werewolves prowling among monstrous trees with blood-red leaves. The boundary was unbreachable. The monsters could not cross it. Yet deep down, a stubborn thought had lingered. What if the story wasn't a lie? Especially when the tutor emphasized one crucial detail. It didn't and couldn't have a happy ending. Perhaps the tutor had exaggerated to make the tale more dramatic, or perhaps he'd softened the truth to avoid scaring his young charge too much. One thing never changed, though. Every night the same story repeated like a chant. He'd never asked why. Cedric wouldn't have answered anyway. There were questions the old man refused to discuss, and so he'd simply listened, staring into Cedric's icy, nearly colorless eyes, eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. In this forest there is no life. Though it wasn't always so, Cedric's voice would flow, smooth and melodic, the kind of voice that made listening effortless. Long ago, an enormous kingdom stood here, with magnificent cities, lush gardens, and fertile fields. But its people decided their lives should not be like those of ordinary folk. They were powerful magicians, their abilities strong from birth. They considered themselves special, deserving of more. They sought dominion over forces beyond human control, and crossed the line. They made a mistake. They performed an ancient ritual meant for beings not of this world. The forest remembers everything. A surge of uncontrollable magical energy swallowed the kingdom, burying it beneath its roots. Houses leveled to the ground, palaces crumbled to ruins, gardens turned wild, and trees rose from the fields. Centuries have passed, but the people of that kingdom do not rest in graves among the ruins of their homes. They care not that their time ended long ago. Their lives remain beyond the boundary, which humanity had no right to cross. And now they are part of Morgard, the forest of the damned. Cedric always spoke like this, his voice lulling and hypnotic. It soothed, invited sleep. But falling asleep without hearing the end of the story, a story already memorized, meant dreaming of running through the forest. Gnarled branches with sharp twigs would whip your face and tear at your clothes. Wet leaves would slap against your skin with a sickening squelch. And the running wouldn't last long. From behind, then from all sides, came the sound of rustling steps. They would knock you down, pin you to the unyielding ground, and sink their teeth into your flesh. Why? Why had Cedric told him about Morgard every night before bed? He'd never gotten an answer. And then the chance to ask was gone. Where are you, Cedric, old sorcerer, old friend? Why didn't the cursed forest remain just a dream? Why didn't it stay a story told in childhood? Why has the nightmare become reality? The chill still prickled his skin, the sensation of crossing something eternal and inescapable lingering in his body. The air had turned thick, viscous, reluctant to let him pass. One moment, and the familiar living forest was behind him. A strange hum echoed in his head more than just a sound. If he strained his imagination, he could almost discern words. "Farewell, human." The lone rider on his black horse yanked the reins sharply, exhaling shakily as he tried to process what had just happened. There was no fear in his bright gray eyes, not yet. Only surprise, slowly giving way to the grim realization of the terrifying reality that had replaced the tense chase in an instant. The boundary. He looked back in despair. No, it wasn't the boundary anymore. He had crossed it. The frantic thought that this was the end, that there was nowhere left to run, refused to settle in his mind. His gaze darted between the trunks of trees, noting the line that divided the two forests, the living and the dead. It was almost visible. If it weren't for the arrows thudding into bark close by, the frenzied pace of the chase, or the branches whipping his face, he might have noticed sooner. Morgard didn't hide its nature. It revealed itself openly. There was no clearing, no markers to signify the boundary. Just an abrupt end to the living trees and the start of blackened trunks and crimson leaves. Among the greenery, figures of riders appeared. They were pulling their reins sharply, their actions betraying that, unlike him, they knew what the boundary was. Laughter echoed. The pursuers held bows but weren't in any rush to fire. Well, looks like our prey fell into the hands of other hunters. Never seen the undead feast before. Let's watch. Hey, Prince Loran. It's been a while since the creatures of Morgard had a meal like this. He stiffened. They knew his name. He wasn't some random target. As for who had hired them, that remained a mystery. Not that it mattered now. He had been back in his homeland for only a day and hadn't yet made sense of the situation. The pursuers were wrong. He wasn't a prince. His father had stripped him of the title, and for the past 5 years, no one had called him that. He had even kept only a childhood nickname for himself. Loran. That's what his mother had called him, a name he cherished in her memory. Memories. Perhaps the only thing left in his life that had any right to exist. His world had already crumbled once, shattering into countless unimaginable fragments, each one harboring pain. And now, it was happening again. For real this time, not like before, when, for some reason, he hadn't died. Now, in the near-silent stillness of the forest, his future was disappearing. The forest from his dreams. The trees were almost exactly as he had imagined them, black massive trunks with twisted snake-like branches that writhed as if alive, covered with countless crimson leaves. Beneath his horse's hooves, the ground rang out with a hollow thud, unnaturally hard like stone. The approaching twilight cast thick shadows between the trees, impenetrable patches of darkness slipping through the web of interwoven branches, a stark reminder that this was a different world. A world that did not belong to light. A world that did not belong to life. A world from which there was no escape. There was no going back. The boundary could not be crossed in reverse. The people on the other side of the invisible line smiled mockingly. Their horses, lathered with sweat from the long chase, trembled nervously, eager to bolt despite their exhaustion. The riders tugged hard on the reins, forcing them to remain still. Animals always sensed the boundary more acutely, but his own horse had been unable to stop, the long, grueling chase through unfamiliar woods leaving no time for hesitation. Loran suddenly realized he could barely hear his pursuers anymore. Their voices reached him as if from a great distance, fragments of sentences breaking apart into near-meaningless phrases. The air felt increasingly empty, as if sound itself had refused to cross over from the world of the living. Yet their mocking faces were clear. their eyes alight with anticipation for the spectacle they were about to witness. Yes, it was impossible to recross the line dividing the two worlds, the living and the dead. Morgard didn't release its victims, just as it didn't allow its inhabitants to leave. There was no life here, no food, and any accidental visitor became a rare and long-awaited prey. He remembered from the same childhood tale that hunger was their curse, their eternal punishment. And now, their prey was him. They would tear him apart and devour him, a fate far worse than dying from an archer's well-placed arrow. There was no point asking why this was happening to him. No point trying to fix it. This wasn't a dream. Reality was far worse. His gaze darted to the faces of the hunters, hunters of rare prey. These would be the last people he would see in his life. He had no intention of speaking. What could he possibly say to his would-be executioners? Ask them why. For what reason? They wouldn't answer. The mercenary code forbade responding to a victim's questions. It would only provoke more laughter. And behind him, the emptiness grew, a cold, terrifyingly lifeless void, inescapable and unbearably real. A bitter smile touched his lips. How strange to die without knowing the reason behind the hunt. He had been the youngest in the family, never a contender for the title. His two older brothers had been trained in the art of war by their father. They were warriors, heirs. He had been his mother's favorite, her little boy, the one she hadn't wanted to let go. Yes, he had received an excellent education, but his days had been spent not in sword training but in reading books and listening to the stories of old Cedric, his tutor. The age gap between him and his brothers was nearly 10 years, and his father had never paid him much attention. To him, Loran had always been just a boy, helpless and insignificant. Death had made a strange choice. Not everyone was as lucky as him. Slowly, Loran drew his sword from its sheath. His fingers tightened around the hilt, feeling its faint, prickling chill even through the glove, as if the weapon's energy was flowing into him. His body moved out of habit, but his mind clung to one detached thought. His time had already stopped, frozen in these final moments while his heart pounded its frantic rhythm in his chest. The setting sun's rays barely filtered through the tangled branches above, glinting brightly off the frosted edges of the blade. A parting gift from Viola. A mage's sword, not a warrior's, adorned with intricate runes. A silver blade. She had never accepted his decision to choose a different path, to refuse to become her apprentice. Even when he had begun defeating the best warriors in the tribe, she had shaken her head. Your strength lies elsewhere. Well, the pup's got teeth, one of the pursuers whistled. Loran saluted them with his sword, then yanked the reins, steering his horse deeper into the forest. The spectacle was cancelled. He didn't need an audience. The black horse snorted in protest before bolting into the thicket. Much had changed in the past 5 years, but Loran had no intention of returning home. There was no one waiting for him there. All he had wanted was to visit his mother's grave, to say goodbye, and then leave for Avalon forever. Yet deep down, he had known that memories and stubbornness wouldn't allow him to spend the next 5 years peacefully waiting for the portal to open again, not without at least trying to understand the tragedy that had befallen his family. He had forced himself to change, to step over his own desires. But the longing for the happy days of his childhood, when his mother was still alive, continued to burn in his heart, twisting his thoughts and offering no peace. He hadn't been able to kill the love he felt for his home, for the family he no longer had. And now, even the chance to learn the truth was gone. His return had played a cruel joke on him. Loran's gaze moved indifferently over his surroundings. The world around him was one that had only ever existed in stories. A world far removed from his own reality, in dreams, in tales, in legends. Anywhere but here, this close, this real. His thoughts were jumbled, his mind refusing to accept the truth. Was this the end? The line beyond which only death awaited? Black tree trunks intertwined like snakes. Sharp branches seemed to pierce through the dense, fleshy leaves on purpose, while reddish drops of sap constantly dripped to the ground. The blood of Morgard, which would soon mingle with his own. But he felt no fear, although waves of terror seemed to brush his skin, stirring his hair with an icy breeze. It was external, a horror that belonged to the forest itself. The horse had long since slowed to a walk, its reins dangling loosely around its neck. The sound of its hooves echoed hollowly through the forest. Loran knew he wasn't alone. He could feel their eyes on him. Whimpers and quiet sighs reached his ears. They followed him but did not strike. What are they waiting for? The runed sword in his hand glowed faintly in the deepening twilight, an almost useless trinket. He had never learned to wield the true power of the blade, but it was silver, which meant he could at least kill a few of the creatures. Loran's free hand found the medallion hanging around his neck. It was the only thing he had allowed himself to take from home, a medallion bearing an image of his entire family, even his father. The medallion was a family relic, passed down through generations, though Cedric had added the image as if he'd known. Or perhaps he had known. He longed to open the medallion, to see their faces, but it was too dark. He merely clenched it tighter in his hand. A bitter sorrow burned in his chest. It was a foolish way to die. He had never thought of death as something unreal. It had always been close, living on the edge of his blade, breathing icy wind into his face during battles with stronger and more numerous foes. His death was supposed to be swift, sudden. He had decided that long ago. Decided it when he refused Viola's offer and chose, against himself, to walk the path of a warrior. Your strength lies elsewhere. I know, but I don't need strength. I don't need victory. He glared angrily around him. This isn't right. Why are you hesitating? He wanted to scream and charge headlong through the forest. Let the chase begin again. Why did I dodge their arrows? Why did I run? It could have ended differently. You were right, Father, when you said there would be no return for me. You were rarely wrong. In that one town on the edge of Miros he had managed to visit, he had heard the people say that King Edmund was gravely ill. He no longer left the palace, barely ate. And just as 5 years ago, a host of mages and mercenaries had once again been hired to search for the prince. The people pitied the great ruler who had never lost a battle, and condemned the son who had abandoned his father. Why, Father? What was the point of that meeting? You burned everything to the ground. I meant nothing to you. None of us meant anything to you. We were just weapons to achieve your unknown goals. Your older sons died for your victories. Your wife died protecting your youngest son. You have no heirs left. You need no one. You're dying alone, just like I am. Loran had always known there was madness in his father. Edmund hadn't seen those closest to him. His only goal had been war. He went into battle and won, heedless of the losses, indifferent to the lives lost. Others died and he lived even though he fought at the front lines. He had brought Miros glory and wealth, and everyone spoke of him as the great King Edmund. The great are never condemned. Everything is forgiven. But Loran couldn't forgive him. He couldn't forgive him for his mother's death. Suddenly the trees parted. The horse took a few more steps before stopping. Loran could feel its trembling. Before him stretched an enormous clearing, and as far as the eye could see, the figures of gray, humanoid creatures stood frozen in hunting stances. There were too many, even for this vast field. Slowly he glanced behind him. A ring of glowing eyes extended deep into the forest. Loran was surprised by his own calm. Now, as death revealed its face, there was no panic, no fear. His heartbeat slowed, and a chill pricked at his fingertips. It was almost like training in Avalon, only there, the chance of death hadn't been so high. "Forgive me, Viola. I can't keep my promise. Goodbye." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a black shadow leap toward him. Gleaming fangs flashed nearby. Loran barely managed to twist aside and slash with his sword. The werewolf dodged in midair, landing under the horse's hooves. The black stallion reared, letting out a piercing whinny. The ranks of undead stirred, and a massive wave of gray bodies surged forward. Loran gritted his teeth and instinctively reached for the faint spark of life within his chest, his own life force, which could serve as a source for at least some kind of spell. Yet he knew it was useless. Here in Morgard, there was only one kind of magic, the magic of the dead. Only the most powerful sorcerers dared to wield other forces in this place, and even they could pass the boundary in both directions. He was no sorcerer. Though his adoptive mother had insisted that magic was in his blood, and that if he had studied, but now, that would only delay the inevitable. Still, he pulled off his left glove and placed his hand on the horse's neck. His fingers tingled again. Using his own power had always been an instinctive act. He had never accessed it deliberately. Yet this time, something specific happened. An energy wave flowed down through the animal's body, forming a cocoon around it up to his hand. However, his hand itself became immobilized. The moment he lifted it, the shield would vanish. At least his own legs were protected under the cocoon. There was no time to experiment further. A dozen gray creatures leaped at the stallion simultaneously, but recoiled with shrieks. A visible energy barrier flared around the animal, marking its boundaries. The monsters howled in frustration. The undead shifted their attack, leaping high into the air to target the rider instead. The sword sang, becoming a glowing streak of light. The silver blade tore through the tangible darkness of the night, the thick air of the forest, and the bloodless bodies of his foes. The blade loved this song, but today it was different. It was the final one, and those for whom it sang had already known death. Long ago, centuries past. This battle would be short. Victory was impossible. Loran struck wildly at snarling jaws and reaching claws, severing several heads with a single swing. He stabbed and shoved with his blade, driving back the creatures that nearly overwhelmed him. He couldn't stop himself. They had to stop him. He had entered Avalon by accident. The path to the sealed world appeared only once every 5 years, for just one night. Legend held that Avalon was a fragment of an ancient foreign world, one that had perished centuries ago in a war with powerful sorcerers. Many didn't believe the stories, but the fact remained that the people of Avalon were different. And if a stranger managed to pass through the portal, their journey often ended there. The guards allowed passage only to mages or those with nowhere else to go. The exhausted child, barely able to stay on his feet, didn't know why he had come to this place. It was his 3rd night of wandering into the unknown, and he was utterly spent, trudging aimlessly along the road. The road, however, had led him to the gates of Avalon. And, in a near unconscious state, he crossed the portal glowing with a faint crimson light. The guards couldn't read his thoughts and simply let him pass, as one who had nowhere else to go. Avalon became his home, but it could never bring peace to his soul. Avalonian mercenaries were considered the best warriors in the outer world, but few ever left their homeland. Those who did faced a long wait to return. Every 5 years, the portal would reopen. Avalon had its own war, one that required skilled fighters to guard its borders. For generations, they had fought against the mountain tribes, who sought to claim their fertile valleys. When Loran expressed his desire to train as a warrior, the people of Avalon laughed. High Sorceress Viola, who had inexplicably chosen to adopt the foreign child, had sensed in him a unique magical gift. But the boy had refused to become her apprentice. He wanted to hold a sword, not a staff. And his wish came true. At first, the stubborn outsider was allowed into training merely as a joke, placed among children who were just beginning to wield weapons. They laughed at his lanky frame towering over the 4-year-olds. But soon, the laughter stopped. His teachers no longer found it amusing. He learned, and he learned too quickly, as if he wasn't striving to win, but simply to know how to fight. His gift was his ability to sense his opponent in ways no one else could. He could dodge any strike, parry any thrust, and counter with such speed that defenses became meaningless. He had rejected magic, but Avalon insisted on calling him a sorcerer. No ordinary human could move like that. Impossible. They didn't understand that fighting was the only way he could forget. They didn't know that speed saved him from the ghosts of a terrifying past. He simply wanted to not remember, not think. For that, he needed to become one with the blade, to transform into steel itself, to merge with the weapon, and to forget that the rest of the world existed. A sorcerer. So be it. He didn't care. But now, Loran cursed his gift. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Victims silently threw themselves at his blade. He slashed through their bodies, severed their heads, robbing them forever of their endless existence. Yet his own death stretched on too long. And suddenly, he realized something. His father had always fought the same way, leading from the front lines. But his enemies had been living people. He, too, couldn't stop until victory was achieved. Loran nearly growled in anger. So that's whose gift I inherited. That's what drove you into battle, Father, the desire for death. But no one ever gave you peace, Father. A hollow laugh escaped his lips. His sword hand throbbed with searing pain. His muscles stiffened under the spreading weakness in his body. He didn't know how much time had passed. It didn't matter. Dark circles blurred his vision, and a ringing filled his head. Each ragged breath escaped his throat as a hoarse gasp. His fingers, slick with his own blood, betrayed him, loosening their grip on the sword's hilt. It doesn't matter. Morgard could have been your cure, Father. It doesn't care who it kills. It always gets what it wants. There are no victors here. Loran felt the moment coming, felt it but made no attempt to prevent it. He had no strength left. The black werewolf had been waiting, cautious, after its first failed attack. It was unsettling, even troubling, how this prey continued to resist for so long. No human had ever held out like this, not even when armed, not even when wielding silver. None of them had ever killed a single inhabitant of Morgard. Only sorcerers were capable of such feats. The werewolf growled low. It had once been a powerful mage, and the presence of this human stirred long-buried instincts and echoes of magical abilities. A human. It sniffed the air. The tantalizing scent of blood surrounded its prey, growing stronger with each wound inflicted. It drove its kin into a frenzy, accelerating their attacks. So young, and so strong. A human? For a fleeting moment, something ancient and primal stirred within it. a wave of terror that quickly dissipated. The prey was inexperienced, unaware of how to use its strength, dying. The protective cocoon of energy around the horse trembled and began to collapse. The werewolf coiled like a spring and leaped onto the horse's back in one fluid motion. The human swung the sword as if knowing death was behind him, but it was too late. Teeth sank into his shoulder, into the arm holding the weapon, and the werewolf bit down with fervor, relishing the rush of warm, salty blood. Lauren let out a muffled groan. His arm went numb instantly. He caught the slipping sword with his left hand and stabbed backward. The werewolf jerked and howled but didn't loosen its grip, shaking its head violently, tearing his shoulder apart with its massive fangs. Teeth sank into his leg. He felt the last remnants of the protective cocoon vanish. Then he was yanked, pulled from the saddle. The werewolf bore down on him with its full weight, pinning him against the horse's neck, forcing him to the ground. "Die, you beast," Lauren hissed, mustering the last of his strength to drive his sword deep into the massive, crushing body of the undead, pressing him down. The blade sank into the hilt, and he felt it wrench free from his fingers as the werewolf collapsed lifelessly to the ground. His horse neighed sharply and reared. Loran gripped the saddle with his good hand, realizing he was now defenseless. Immediately, greedy mouths latched onto his bleeding wounds. He was pulled and bitten from every direction, teeth sinking into his still living flesh. Loran shut his eyes. This couldn't last forever. It took him a moment to realize that no more fangs were tearing at his body. Waves of pain coursed through him, clouding his mind. On the edges of his awareness, he noticed an eerie silence. The space around him felt empty, as if something had consumed this part of the forest, pushing the rest of the world far away. He also felt fear, an alien, suffocating terror emanating from those who had just been in control. His head spun as a deep sadness and hopelessness seeped into his consciousness, their ancient pain spanning centuries. A hand steadied him in the saddle, preventing him from falling. His horse began to move, first walking and then picking up speed. Loran clung on with all his might, barely keeping himself from collapsing to the ground. He had no idea what was happening, but it no longer mattered. His only wish was for this night to end at last. "It's just a nightmare," he thought. "Just a bad dream, nothing more." His eyes remained shut, but even through his eyelids, he felt the bright rays of the sun hitting his face. Warm breezes brushed his skin, carrying the scent of grass and meadow flowers. Birds chirped cheerfully in the distance. He didn't want to open his eyes. His eyelids felt heavy, almost impossible to lift. With great effort, he cracked them open, only to immediately turn his head away from the glaring sunlight. Blades of grass swayed before his face, tickling his skin. It was surprisingly peaceful and serene, especially after the nightmare he'd experienced during the night. Then why does my body ache so badly? A dull pain radiated through him, accompanied by a profound weakness that made even keeping his eyes open a struggle. So it was a dream? Suddenly it felt as if a veil had been pulled from his mind. His thoughts cleared and his senses sharpened to an overwhelming degree. Moments ago, he had been surrounded only by grass, a meadow, and the simplicity of nature. Now, he became acutely aware of something else. 50 paces away, a cold, lifeless barrier marked the division between two worlds, the living and the dead, the boundary of Morgard. So close, right there. He felt it in his very being, every cell of his body absorbing its presence. A dense wave of air seemed to ripple across his skin, seeping into his muscles, freezing his blood and pulling, calling to him. Loran bit his lip and groaned softly. The sensation vanished instantly, releasing him. But the awareness of the boundary remained, pressing heavily on his mind. From the other side, it felt as though a cold wind was blowing, enveloping him in the icy breath of lifeless emptiness. It wasn't a dream. Loren groaned again. Vivid flashes of the nightmare tore through his mind. He hadn't felt fear during the night, but now a strange, delayed terror gripped him, stronger than anything he'd ever known. But it wasn't fear of dying. It was fear of how he might die. A shiver ran through him. Still, he wasn't in Morgard now. He was near the boundary, but not in Morgard. That was impossible. Morgard didn't release its victims. Only the most powerful sorcerers, armed with forbidden knowledge, could cross the boundary and return. Someone must have pulled him out. Footsteps reached his ears. "You're awake?" A voice, young and lively, broke the silence. Loren tried to lift his head to see his rescuer, but dark spots danced before his eyes. His entire body ached unbearably, and a wave of icy pain crashed through him, pulling him back into unconsciousness. The second time he awoke, he was choking on a bitter taste in his mouth. A cup was pressed between his teeth, and cold, stinging liquid was being poured into him. Instinctively, Loren swallowed twice to avoid choking, but immediately began coughing, trying to push away the strong hands holding him down. The hands gripped his head firmly, forcing his mouth open to pour in more of the vile-tasting liquid. "Relax. It's medicine," the familiar voice said. "The more you drink, the better for you." The bitterness burned his tongue and scraped his throat. Loren coughed, gasping for air as tears streamed from his eyes. "All right, I think that's enough," his rescuer said, finally letting go. Loren rolled onto his side, curling up as another coughing fit racked his body. It took him a long time to catch his breath, and when he did, he was surprised to find that he could move. The overwhelming weakness from before had mostly faded. If not for the pain still throbbing throughout his body and his numb right arm, he might have said he felt fine. At last, he straightened up and sat in the grass looking around. A narrow clearing stretched out before him, with a forest beginning just a few steps away. Beyond the trees, he could see the unyielding wall of Morgard's boundary, which he still sensed as vividly as ever. Loren shifted his gaze to the one who had saved him. The stranger sat by a fire, stirring something in a pot over the coals. He looked only a few years older than Loren, 18 or 20 at most. His thick black hair fell to his shoulders, his skin was dark, but his eyes were the opposite, bright green, glowing almost unnaturally, as if lit from within. His features weren't entirely human, carrying a wild, untamed beauty. This youth could have been anyone, but Loren would never have taken him for a sorcerer. Sorcerers didn't have broad shoulders, arms corded with muscle, or a posture so inherently commanding, and his gaze lacked the solemn wisdom typical of sorcerers, filled instead with mischief and recklessness. His clothes were practical and sturdy, like those of a hunter, with a travel cloak draped over his shoulders. But Loren saw no sword or bow. Only a dagger in its sheath hung at his waist. The stranger glanced at him, his green eyes glinting with amusement. "How do you feel?" "Almost normal," Loren replied, his voice raspy and his throat raw. He coughed again. "Thanks, I guess, but what did you pour into me?" "I've never tasted anything so vile." The stranger smiled. "But it brings even the dead back to life. I came up with this brew myself. It works wonders. Doesn't completely kill the pain, but it restores strength." "The dead?" Loren muttered, his gaze shifting to his own body. His right shoulder was tightly bandaged, and while he couldn't move his arm, his fingers twitched slightly. The sleeves of his shirt were shredded and soaked with blood, his tunic torn and equally stained. His pants were reduced to tatters, revealing ragged, gaping wounds underneath. Loran shuddered at the sight of himself. "I treated all your wounds with Rister sap. It disinfects well and stops the bleeding almost immediately." "Yeah," Loran muttered, shivering again. He had heard of Restore sap before, a plant native to the dead forest of Morgard. Only the most skilled healers dared to use it. It was highly effective, but a single drop too much could turn the medicine into a deadly poison. The stranger must have noticed Loran's concerned expression, because he quickly added, "Don't worry. I know how to handle it." "Are you a healer?" "Not exactly." "Then a sorcerer?" "Not quite that either." "Let's just say I have certain skills." Loran scoffed. "With only certain skills, it's impossible to get out of Morgard, and you managed to drag me out as well. By the way, I should thank you for saving me. May I know your name?" "Lucas." "But as for saving you, it's too early to call it that." "What do you mean? We're not in Morgard anymore." "The boundary is near, but we crossed it." Lucas nodded. "Can you feel it? The boundary?" Yeah. Loran stammered as a cold shiver ran through his body, a gnawing unease twisting in his chest. "Did you feel it before? Before tonight?" Loran shook his head, instinctively clutching his wounded shoulder. He could feel an icy chill radiating from the bite, slowly spreading through his body. "I was bitten by a werewolf," he said flatly, though a storm raged within his heart. He wanted to scream, to howl in anger. No, he hadn't escaped Morgard. It hadn't let him go. Morgard never released its victims. It had stayed with him, become a part of him. Here and now, he was part of it, forever. "Werewolf," he repeated in a hollow voice, his gaze turning thoughtful as he studied Lucas. "Interesting reaction. Do others react differently? There haven't been any others. You're the first I've pulled out of Morgard. By the way, what's your name?" "Loran." "And was it worth the effort of fending off the undead and dragging me through the forest? Would you have preferred being torn apart and eaten? Seems like a pretty lousy way to go." Loran let out a bitter chuckle. "I'd agree. But what's the alternative? What am I now? A future werewolf? Or am I already one and should just head straight back to Morgard?" Lucas shrugged and removed the pot from the fire. Loran noticed that Lucas's right hand was covered by a tight leather glove up to the elbow. "The transformation has just begun. Until the first full moon, you'll remain human. You have 7 days." Loran lowered his head involuntarily. 7 days of life. Well, last night, he hadn't even had that. Still, he could already count himself as good as dead. 7 days wouldn't change that. Yet in that time, he could try to find out who had ordered the hunt for him. Or he could meet his father one last time, to look him in the eyes. Or visit his mother's grave as he had originally intended. He clenched his fists. At least he could do something before his path in this world came to an end. "Fine," he said hoarsely, staring intently at Lucas. "Thanks for at least giving me that. But what happens after? Will I become a werewolf? Will I start attacking people? I'm not in Morgard. It will call to you, and you won't be able to resist its call. But I wouldn't advise straying far from the boundary. In your urge to return, you'll tear apart anyone who stands in your way." Loran collapsed back to the ground, utterly drained. "But I don't understand. I killed them. Back in Morgard. I know their lives, the lives of the werewolves, ended forever." "Congratulations, you have a gift, Loran." "How amusing," Lucas said, looking at him intently. "And that's precisely why I don't want your life to end so soon." Loran shook his head stubbornly. "So you need a gift? A magical one, I suppose? Then I'll turn to the sorcerers. Lucas sighed. Not every sorcerer has the power to kill a werewolf. Only a few do. But any sorcerer can bind a werewolf with spells, chain it with enchanted restraints, and calmly experiment on it. You would become a rare and highly valuable specimen. They'd never let you go. No sorcerer has ever had a werewolf outside Morgar. They'd never kill you, and you'd spend the rest of your life as their test subject. It would be a very long life, Loran, so I wouldn't recommend turning to the sorcerers. They've been racking their brains trying to study any of Morgard's inhabitants, up close, so to speak. Loran sighed deeply. Then I'll drown myself. You won't be able to. Why not? A werewolf's essence won't allow it. Really? Then maybe I'll throw myself into a fire. You'll only get burned, and not entirely. And how do you plan to keep yourself in the flames? Yeah, that's a problem, Loran muttered, his eyes turning skyward with despair. So I'm going to become a werewolf anyway? Fine. If you won't help me, then after I finish my business, I'll surrender to the sorcerers. Let me serve the noble cause of studying the undead. They won't find another subject anyway. At least they'll make sure I don't harm anyone else. Lucas winced. You're condemning yourself to a life of captivity, forever. Morgard is a prison too. At least among the sorcerers, I'd be around people. You'd endure constant pain. Their experiments would focus on finding a way to kill you. Then I'll hope they succeed, Loran said bitterly. Thanks for enlightening me about my near future. But I need to go. He rose decisively to his feet and glanced around. I don't see my horse. It's gone. It stayed in Morgard. It didn't even make it to the boundary. Its wounds were too severe. I took the saddlebags off it, Lucas said, nodding behind Loran. Turning, Loran saw his belongings lying in the grass. Rifling through the bags, he pulled out clean clothes and began changing. The medallion, Lucas said coldly. Take it off. Loran flinched. He had already torn the remnants of his shirt from his body, working one-handed, and now stood bare-chested. The sunlight played cheerfully on the silver medallion hanging around his neck. What? Your medallion is silver, Lucas explained. Soon you won't be able to touch silver. It will burn your skin. Take it off. Clutching the medallion in his fist, Loran yanked hard. The silver chain snapped. His heart pounded unusually fast as he opened the medallion. The tiny picture inside was blurry for some reason, as though something was obstructing his vision. Rubbing his eyes, Loran was surprised to feel moisture on his skin. Tears? He hadn't cried since his mother's funeral. He'd forgotten what it felt like. That was how it had to be. His vision cleared. Loran ran a finger over the image, wiping away a tear. His family, his father, with his stern face and detached, cold gaze. His brothers, fair-haired and gray-eyed, so much like their father, yet their eyes never held the same lifeless chill. And his mother, the dark-haired beauty with clear blue eyes. He was the only one who resembled her. Slowly, Loran closed the medallion, his hand trembling. This might be the last time he ever saw their faces. He slipped the medallion into his belt pouch and struggled to pull on a clean shirt. Weakness spread through his body again. Blood had pooled in his boots, and his legs were covered in it, but there was nowhere to wash. With a sigh, Loran pulled on his pants and boots. He tossed his shredded, bloodied clothes into the fire. Lucas watched silently. Loran slung the saddlebags over his good shoulder and looked around, trying to choose a direction. The place was unfamiliar, the forest unknown, but he instinctively knew which way to go. Somewhere deep in his mind, a voice whispered the location of Myros's capital, and the direction he now faced toward the city filled him with dread. 5 days straight, without stopping? He asked quietly. You can feel the distance yourself, Lucas replied calmly. I can, Loran said, his voice heavy with resignation. Straight ahead lay Rita. City was on the other side of the cursed forest. To go around Morgard would take not 5 days, but 10. And I can feel that if I enter Morgard now, I won't make it out again. Lucas nodded. Will you sell me your horse? Please, I have money, Loran pleaded. Lucas silently shook his head, this time in refusal. Farewell, Loran said sharply. He turned and strode off along the edge of the forest,